Thanks again for joining us at the 2022 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, Competitive Advantage Talks, presented by Kager, also known as the Craft Analytics Group. My name is Emily Bridges, and I am a first-year MBA student at Sloan. It is my pleasure to introduce Using Technology to Monitor Workload in Elite Figure Skating. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lindsay Slater, Assistant Professor in the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of Illinois at Chicago, to the stage.
Thank you. Right. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I am excited to get rolling and showing you a little bit more about what we've been doing in figure skating, especially figure skating has been a very hot topic after 2022. So unfortunately, I won't be talking about anything Russian related when it comes to figure skating. We're gonna just be focusing on the US team because I am also the sports science manager for US figure skating. So when we talk about monitoring workload, these theories go back quite a ways. When we first started doing very basic kind of studies, Phil actually was a part of those studies because he worked for the USOPC at the time. And we just looked at vertical forces during jumps, and we actually noted that all jumps are basically the same in terms of vertical loading. So a pop jump is basically when an athlete is gonna go in and do a double, triple, quad now, and they pop and just do 1 revolution or 2 revolutions. The vertical loading for those jumps are actually just as high as they would be for a triple or a quad. So when we took that into account, we actually just decided we're counting all jumps. All jumps are equal. It doesn't matter if you're doing a bunch of triples or you're popping all session, which we have a lot of athletes who do. We just wanted to actually look at how many jumps athletes were doing. We also looked at jump heights, so old school Vicon camera system at University of Delaware on the ice surface. We actually did the full marker load up, and we looked at differences in jump heights. Back then, we didn't have a lot of athletes who were doing quads, and that's why there are 2 asterisks here. So we actually didn't see a lot of changes in jump heights, looking at doubles versus triples. Now we have a lot more athletes doing triple axels and quads, so I think that we actually need to go back and kind of look at that information. I'm not so sure if that still holds up today. But overall, what we've learned is that the number of jumps during training needs to be monitored. That's pretty clear. The problem was all of our athletes were basically doing it with the pen and paper method. And when you ask an Olympic athlete to go back and journal every single time they do a jump, 1, you're relying on their athlete to do it, and 2, you're just not getting accurate data. There are times where they'll count combinations, so 2 or 3 jumps that they're doing as 1. They're not counting the pop jumps. So there was a lot of reason why we wanted to try to use technology to monitor workload as opposed to just relying on pen and paper. So we basically reached out to a bunch of companies, and we said we have these goals. We want to use some sort of IMU to track workload. So making sure that the ultimate priority was to track workload, not to monitor performance. That's very, very huge at the Olympic level athlete because the Olympic athlete does not want me to tell them what they should or should not be doing. That is the fastest way to get an athlete to basically give a sensor back and say, I'm not interested anymore. You have to rely on that athlete. Nathan Chen is where he is for a reason. I am not going to tell him what he can and cannot do. He knows his body better than anyone. What I can do is give him a tool that will help him perform better. And he can use that data as he would like to make sure that he is accurately performing and monitoring his training regimens. So we made sure that that was our first priority. Our second priority was then maybe we can start losing some of these jump characteristics to help you with performance and technique. And then once we have a full picture of what you look like during training, we can actually use data to monitor workload and then actually identify fatigue. And so we had a company, 4D Motion Sports, come out, and we flew them out to Colorado Springs and asked if they could actually capture this on an ice surface. And so we had them hook up 4 sensors, so 4 IMUs to one of our top athletes. So we have 2 on the thighs, 1 at the hip, and 1 on the chest. And we basically said, we're gonna challenge you. Can you actually capture how fast our athlete is rotating when he does a triple Lutz? To date, this happened literally right before the world shut down from the pandemic, so in 2019. And then To date, we had no one who was able to actually capture it without saturating the angular rotation, because our athletes are obviously rotating at a pretty fast speed. So they could actually successfully capture it, and then the plus for us, like Phil was talking about, we didn't have to necessarily limit what part of the ice we were working with, because with that motion capture system with markers, we've used it before. Basically, if you have this full ice surface, we're telling all of our high-level athletes you have to jump in one specific circle. You're never gonna get accurate data from that. If they leave that circle, then you've lost all of that data, and it also takes about an hour plus to set up. In this case, it took us 5 minutes or so to set up. We basically gave them the full ice surface because it was all app-based, and there they go about their day. It was actually the best feedback we've ever had from athletes. And so we actually took it a step further. We wanted to know, could we actually capture the full body? And this is one of my favorites, because obviously everyone wants to know what's successful and when you fall. And we could capture it all, right? So we see exactly what the head is doing, we see what the arms are doing, we see the footwork going into the jump. We can do it. The problem with this one, as awesome as it looks, is it's actually really difficult for an athlete or a coach to set this up. So it would mean I would have to actually travel to the rinks and do this. Then I would have to spend about 10 minutes setting it up, because this is 11 sensors on the athlete. It's not that hard compared to a marker-based system using 11 IMUs. It's 10 minutes versus probably 30 to 45 minutes, but it's still kind of complicated. And that's when we actually transitioned to a single sensor. It was also conveniently right in March 2020, when I no longer had access to the ice rinks where our athletes were training, because we were not allowed to travel. And so we basically challenged 4D Motion. We now identified that you can do this. How much data can we get from one sensor? And to give you an idea, that one sensor is smaller than an Apple Watch. So when we talk about something light that doesn't impede performance, that doesn't actually upset any of the athletes, this was the ultimate, right? One single sensor, we connect it to an app, so we just basically downloaded a figure skating module right to their iPhone or their iPad, and basically they get immediate feedback. So this would be an athlete who would be turning on the sensor, wearing it on their hip. That's it, they clip it on, they go about their day, they do however many hours of training that they want to do that day, and they get immediate feedback on their app about what jump they just did, how many revolutions they did, which is huge if it was a cheetah jump or not. We're hoping at some point we adapt this and change some of the judging system in figure skating rather than using old school cameras. We're working on it. How fast you rotated, how long you were in the air, how high you jumped, and when you actually hit that peak angular velocity. Keep in mind that some of these things are estimates, and we've really refined the algorithm by collecting more and more data to identify the exact time where they take off and when they land the ice. The hardest one has been, if you're familiar with figure skating at all, are loop jumps. So loop jumps, you actually start the rotation on the ice before you leave, which means you've triggered the start of the jump before you've actually taken off. Otherwise, every other jump is pretty clean. And so we're going to talk through case studies. We've had 3, to be fair, 5 of the 6 single skaters at the games wore the sensor leading up to the games to prepare. And we're going to talk case studies in terms of 3 athletes who were at the games and how we've used the sensor. Because the fact of the matter is, every athlete is unique, and we use it in very different ways. Case study 1 is an athlete who unfortunately had puberty issues. And I say issues only because when you go through puberty as a figure skater, your entire body changes. Now you've lost usually your jumps, and it usually takes us 6 to 8 months, maybe longer, to actually get back technique or completely shift technique after you go through puberty so that we can actually get you rotating quickly again. That is why the Russians tend to be really successful, because all their athletes peak before they go through puberty. So for us, we're always about the longevity of the athlete. We want to make sure we're doing everything the right way, the healthy way. And so after they go through puberty, it's a matter of how we can keep you competitive and get you back. So what we know, triple axels, on the female side, you have to be rotating about 1900 to 1950 degrees per second. We estimate the Russians are actually closer to 2000 to 2100 degrees per second. So you have to rotate very, very quickly in a triple axel. This athlete coming back in February, so at the end of nationals in January, was rotating about 1750. So rotating way too slow. So basically we reached out to the coaches and said, pull back. You are not going to do any more triple axel training right now. We are going to change what we're doing off ice. We're going to change how we're approaching this athlete. Just having them do over and over and over again these triple axels is just going to make sure she gets injured. Let's pull back and do some other things on the strength and conditioning side. So that's when we pulled in physical therapists, athletic trainers, and her strength and conditioning coach, Brandon Cycle, and basically said, we're shifting everything. Okay, so we basically did not have her skate at all in terms of triple axels. She was allowed to do any other jump she wanted, no triple axels. And then when she came back in March, all of a sudden there's that huge jump. She's in the 1900s. She's still not where we need her to be, but she's better, right? So now we're giving her some leeway, start doing some harness jumps. That means when you have a little bit of support, you're allowed to start doing a few jumps off the harness, but you're not there yet. We know you're not going to be successful, so let's limit kind of where we're putting that impact. And you can see there's this increasing trend. So around May, she's really at peak performance, and we got her back to rotating quickly enough. You see that little downturn in July. She actually got vaccinated and was incredibly fatigued, and it was actually really exciting that it showed up in the data. And then we got her back again in August. So this was how we basically used the sensor for this particular athlete to monitor performance and give her ideas in terms of training loads. The other thing we looked at is kind of where she was doing her time to peak. So looking at that over that full jump time, you can see again in February, she was rotating slow and she was hitting that time to peak so late that, again, it wasn't a recipe for success. So the idea was, can we actually reduce that time to peak so it's a little bit earlier in the jump while we're increasing your rotational velocity? And then July, August, you're seeing that it's that optimal time to peak. That's just over halfway, which is what we would expect. And she's rotating quickly. So that is when we actually start seeing the land jumps. The other thing that we learned from this particular athlete that we've actually seen across the board in every single athlete, developmental and Olympic level, that has worn the sensor is there's a clear trend with angular velocity that obviously it increases doubles, triples, triple axels. We were curious what was happening on the harness. Does it actually look like a triple axel? It does. But the things that were most important to us were those combination jumps. So you have a triple toe and a triple loop combination. What that means are the two jumps you've done last in a combination. So you've done like a triple lutz, triple toe, or triple flip, triple loop, right? So this would be the toe or the loop that's second in the combination. If you look at the angular velocity, it actually looks basically like a triple axel. It doesn't look like any other triple, which makes sense. You don't have as much speed coming in, you're not gonna have as much height, which means you have to rotate faster. But that also means if you don't have as much height and you don't have as much speed, you have a ton of basically rotational loading when you land. So now we're making a recommendation to everyone across the board based on what we've learned from these data. You have to actually monitor how many triples you're doing along with triple axels and quad attempts. So if you are training quads, which almost every single one of our athletes now has to do, they also need to monitor triples. So if they're doing a heavy triple day, they are not doing a heavy quad day. They have to think about that in their planning. And so we've started to teach that to coaches that not all jumps are equal, which is where we started, right? We said all jumps are equal. A pop jump looks like a triple jump, looks like a quad jump. That was the mentality for so long. Now it's this idea of think about triples, triple axels, and quads as the highest level, and think about what your priorities are that day, and then decide where you want to put those other jumps. So again, just like we talked about, we actually monitored the triples and the triple axels together for that athlete, and when we found we monitored them together, she had no more flare-ups of hip pain. So just being able to use these data to help her identify where to change her planning has been really successful. Case study 2 is another athlete. If you haven't noticed a trend with hip pathology, that's everyone in figure skating has a hip pathology. If you haven't had some sort of hip replacement coming out of figure skating, you can consider yourself a success story because most athletes, Tara Lipinski talks about it all the time. She got through the games and then she had to have her hip replaced. But this other female that was training, we basically started off with, how many jumps a day do you think you're doing? She thought she was doing around 60, 70 jumps a day. And just looking at her load, this was a normal day. She said she thought she only did 60. She was actually close to 100 jumps. And you can see that decline in terms of that angular velocity over the course of the day. So over about 2 hours of training, you've done almost 100 jumps and you're fatigued. The fatigue part isn't necessarily that concerning to us. It's the residual fatigue that we were concerned about. So if you fatigue and you're still performing well, fine. If you're fatigued and you're still fatigued the next day, you haven't recovered, then you have residual fatigue, and that's concerning for us. And so we were looking at days where she was doing closer to 70 and was looking pretty good. She had no level of fatigue. So we gave her a recommendation. We said 75 is the max jumps you're allowed to do. If you want to do more than that, you're fine. Again, athletes at this level do not like being told what they can and cannot do. So if you want to do more than 75 jumps, go ahead, but you then have to schedule 2 recovery days after. So if it is that important for you leading up to a competition, a lot of the athletes do this coming into international competition, you want to do 100 jumps, that's fine, but then you have 2 days at around the 40 jump mark. If that's worth it to you, we will not tell you not to do it. She was very compliant. Most days look like this, around the 50, 60 mark, where she actually didn't fatigue at all. She looked great. 1 month later, this is where she is. We've actually trained her body just like progressive overload, like you would do in strength and conditioning, to get to a point where you can do more, right? And so we raised a recommendation. She followed the rules. She did what she was supposed to do. Now your high-load days are 85, which is the dream, right? We don't want to limit what they're doing in practice, but we also don't want them to be injured. So now this is an older athlete who was having a lot of hip pain, and now she's competing well. She's looking great. We've raised her recommendation to 85. 2 months later, here she is at 85. Okay, so there's no fatigue at all. So we were able to use those data to help her train more effectively. The last one was our most interesting case study. So this was a female athlete who was convinced that she wanted a triple axel by Beijing. That gave us about, I don't know, a 7-month timeline to get her a triple axel. We all kind of knew coming in that wasn't going to be super realistic, but we wanted to use data to try to tell her whether or not it was. And so if you look at her angular velocity, this is her in the yellow. Singles, it looked like doubles, which is fine. And then there's this huge jump in terms of how quickly she has to rotate to complete a triple. And what we believe is she's kind of hit a ceiling effect. She's rotating as fast as she can possibly rotate for a triple, which means she doesn't have anything left for that extra half a turn for a triple axel, right? And so we kind of made a recommendation to her after collecting data for about 4 months. We just don't think this is reasonable. We don't think you're actually physically going to be able to do a triple axel by Beijing. If you give us an Italy timeline, 2026, that's a different story. She did not want to talk about 2026, 2022 was the goal. And so she asked us to compare to other athletes who were doing triple axels. And if you look at the trend, there is very different in how that athlete in yellow looks compared to all the other athletes who are capable of doing triple axels. None of those other athletes seem to actually max out and hit their limit at the triples. They have more in them, so there's no ceiling effect for them when they get to the triple axel. Okay, so this is combining those 2 measures that we believe are the most important, that peak angular velocity over time to peak. This athlete in yellow was the only one who saw a decline. And so again, we went back to her and said, we appreciate that you really have this goal, we support you, but we don't think it's possible. And the response was, where can I send the sensor back? I don't want to wear it anymore. So what we learned was that case study 1, the athlete who had gone through puberty and we were trying to get back was all coach-driven. The coaches were so on board with it that we were communicating with them regularly, and they loved it. The athlete bought in because the coaches bought in, and it was very successful. Case study 2 was athlete-driven. We actually never even talked to the coach. The athlete communicated with us very regularly, was always compliant, let us know if she was feeling fatigued, injured. We adjusted the programming appropriately, and again, was a very successful one. Case study 3, we drove it. Myself and the strength and conditioning coach drove the bus. It was not successful. She returned the sensor, and even though she likely had a very successful season in her mind, we probably could have been more successful had she been a little more open to using data. But that's also okay. So I think that was kind of the overarching theme of what we were trying to do with US figure skating, is that it's okay for you to say it's not for me. That's fine, it's not for everyone. Could you probably be more successful if you had an open mind? Sure, we always talk about having an open mindset, being open to new ideas and working together. And that's fine, we were still supportive of her in any way we possibly could be. The last thing I'm gonna say is it was not just me. So this whole project takes a village. We only got this up and running in about a year. So we did a lot of work in terms of refining algorithms, collecting a lot of data, especially in the middle of a pandemic. And so all these people on the slide were instrumental to get this done. So you have Mitch Moyer, who is the athlete high performance director at US Figure Skating. He was very supportive of it. Brandon Cycle was our strength and conditioning coach at US Figure Skating. He has now transitioned to USA Volleyball, but he was phenomenal, and he's probably the reason Nathan is as good as he is. He really has shifted how figure skaters do strength and conditioning now. Scott Rewald, who is Phil Cheatham's colleague at USOPC, or was before Phil had moved on to Sportbox, basically funded this project. So this was a USOPC funded project. They gave us the money to invest in the sensors. So we're very grateful for that. And then Sang Kim is the CEO and founder of 4D Sports, and he has never been more excited, and he's very invested in the Olympic movement. And so we're very grateful that he has been very open-minded and able to work with us on this. So that's all I have. If anyone has any questions about what we've done and where we're going. Yeah.
Hi. So I actually skate as an adult skater, but not nearly at an elite level or competitive level. And I found that it's very difficult to find any wearable tech that will calculate your spin revolution. Did you do any work around camel spins, all of those kinds of things, Bielmans, along with that? Or was it just purely for jumps?
It was purely for jumps only because that's considered the loading aspect of it. So we usually don't monitor how many spins they're doing. To be fair, at least at this level, it's usually hard to get our athletes to do as many spins and work on them as much as they work on the jumps. And we actually have in the algorithm the way that we can pull out spins. So if it lasts a certain amount of time, you know, or they're spinning at a certain rate, then we know it's a spin or a twizzle, so we pull it out. So for this particular project, we haven't done any work with spins. The next phase, we are adding another sensor onto the boot. So there is potential, again, because we're thinking about judging and how we can really move figure skating forward and out of less, like into a more objective sport and less of a subjective sport. And I think there will be potential in that one to actually monitor how many revolutions they've done during spins. But as of now, it's really just jump-based. Yeah.
When looking at the loading for quads, did you guys look at the difference between regular jumps where your arms are just in and when they're above, when you have to pre-rotate before you take off?
We have some data. We are very private about that because for people who are not aware of skating, there's really just one country who always does things with their hands above their head, the Russians, and they seem to get rewarded highly for it. It's actually easier because you can generate more angular velocity and you actually reduce the moment of inertia, so it's actually advantageous. The difference is you have to be really strong. And so it works at a very young level. So when we have 14 and 15-year-olds do it, they can do it very successfully. Asking a 23-year-old skater becomes very complicated just in terms of body mass distribution and how strong your actual abdominals need to be to perform it and get into that jump and stay. That has been our issue. So we can get our 14 to 15-year-olds to do it very successfully. Getting them to do it after puberty has proven to be a little more difficult. But yes, we're on the same page. So I am now working with baseball, and so the ultimate goal is to do something very similar for pitch counts. So there's definitely a direct application in terms of those kinds of things. What we find in baseball, and I am still learning a lot of the lingo in baseball, but there tends to be just an arbitrary number of throws that pitchers are allowed. And what we're finding is it's very similar to skating, where I'm not gonna give every athlete the same number. Like case study 1 versus case study 3 look very different and should have different loading, and I imagine the same thing would happen with pitchers. So we are adapting it right now to be a single sensor program for pitchers. Again, it's gonna be complicated in terms of refining the algorithm for that. And then volleyball is intrigued by jump counts. So we're talking to USA Volleyball as well about whether or not there's potential there. But I think that there are tons of potential. The problem is finding the people who know enough about each individual sport to embed in the technology development there. Yeah.
I'm curious about this research and how different it would be when looking at jumps in pair girls. Because, I mean, just the height and the loading, I assume, is completely different.
Yes. Pairs has been complicated only because the current location for the sensor in skating is at the hip. For those of you who are not familiar with pairs, they are often being grabbed at their hips, so putting a sensor there is impossible and could be dangerous. And so we have been talking to some of our pair skaters who are coming up with ideas of where they could wear it. It's something that we are definitely intrigued by, especially with just the twists, let alone jumps and everything like that. It's something we're intrigued by and want to do, but I felt like we had to get this phase done first, and now we're going to work with some of the pair skaters and adapt it and figure out where we can actually have them wear the sensor that doesn't interfere with performance. But yeah, it's a good question.
All right, and with that, I think we are out of time. But thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you, guys.